Now we're going to commence our topic tonight, or our subject tonight. Steve did say we looked at fire last week. We really want to hone in a little bit tonight in our commencement on this word faith. This word faith, which we see in Daniel chapter 3, absolutely flows out of this story in a manner that's totally astounding when we think about the level of faith and the belief and the trust that these three men stated and showed in Daniel chapter 3. As we said in our last class a fortnight ago, their declaration, their statement which they made, which is literally found right in the centre of this chapter, Daniel chapter 3, and as we found last time, that's where the silence is broken. And for the first time recorded in Scripture, three men stood shoulder to shoulder. I had four fingers up there, and it's quite hard to put three, so I'll use the thumb. Three men stood shoulder to shoulder. They focused their eyes on the king, and without hesitation, they speak to the greatest monarch in the world. And he's not any old monarch. This monarch is one who instilled such terror and trepidation to the extent that Daniel was going to record this. And he says, in a couple of chapters on, he says, people, nations, and languages, and you'll pick that up, a little phrase that is an echo from Daniel chapter 3, all people, all nations, and all languages trembled and feared before Nebuchadnezzar, who, and there's a lovely little fat semicolon right there, it means that you've got to pause and think about that statement. Trembled and feared, and think about that. And here's three young men staring at this king, whom he trembled and feared, whom he kept alive, another little fat semicolon, and think about that. Whom he kept alive. Whom he put to death. And these three friends stood to this man. And normally, there's no second chances with Nebuchadnezzar. If you get on the wrong side of Nebuchadnezzar, as this verse says, you'll be put to death instantly. But it's so interesting in our story, which we will get to in a fortnight's time when we get to verse 14. It's so interesting that these three men are given a second chance, something which is most unusual with Nebuchadnezzar. So as we said, when we get to verse 16 and 17 and 18, the silence is broken and the words of faith flow out of the mouth of these three men. Let's read them again. I just love verse 16 to 18. I know we read it last time, but Matt only had 7 verses to read, so I'm sure we won't mind if we read these verses together. Verse 16, O Nebuchadnezzar, they say in the middle of that verse, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. It means we don't need to think about this. We're going to come, here's our answer straight away. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. As we said, the greatest testimony of faith right there in verse 16, 17 and 18. A statement which, as we said, they fearlessly, courageously and faithfully, with absolute confidence, uttered in unison to that king, as each friend stood shoulder to shoulder, supporting each other, even though possibly they could hear the cracking and smell the burning of the fiery furnace, and perhaps smoke was even drifting their way as they said these words, because over there was the absolute reality of a fiery burning furnace. But they were able to say with confidence, our God is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us. And I really want to emphasise this little statement for a minute, because as we're going to see, their God hadn't always delivered them in the past in a way that they may have expected. We're going to consider a situation where God didn't deliver for those three men, which these three men knew had occurred in the past, which makes this statement even more powerful, persuasive and encouraging when they've said this in Daniel chapter 3, when earlier we're going to see that God didn't deliver them in a way they possibly may have expected. He is able to deliver, said these three young men. You know, that, young people and brothers and sisters, is formidable faith. There's no doubt about that. This is formidable, inspiring, impressive faith in that statement which they made. Now, we know Hebrews chapter 11. We know it so well. Faith is the confidence. It's the confidence of what we hope for. It's the assurance of what we don't see. But I want to just emphasise faith a little bit more, and especially in this situation here in Daniel chapter 3. And I've thought long about this little statement, and you may even want to jot it down. If you don't get it down, I'm happy to provide it after. You think about this. Faith is an absolute trust that is backed by an unshakable belief that ignites us to believe beyond what the eye can see. Think about those words. Absolute trust, unshakable belief that ignites us to believe beyond what the eye can see happening around us. This is important to consider. Faith sees above and beyond the present circumstances. It's not distracted by the here and now. It's not distracted by what is happening all around us. You see, it's so easy to say that we have to develop this kind of faith. And so often in my life, brothers and sisters, young people, my faith takes a battering when things around me in the present do occur. But we've got to rise to the level of faith that these three friends demonstrated, a faith that is not distracted by what is going on around us, however fierce those flames are, or however black that smoke may be. Let's continue. Faith looks further into the future than in the present. Now think about this with these three friends. It's not about the there and then. It's all about the there and then, not the here and now. So it's about the future. Faith is all about the future, not the here and now. Our faith is not based on the present. It's not based on our current situation. It's not based upon our circumstances or our condition. Our faith is based entirely on the future, and when we have this faith, it expands upon and draws us into the certainty of the promised future. He will deliver, said these three friends. And brothers and sisters and young people, when faith all goes well, when life is calm, when there are no disappointments, when there are no disasters, when there are no calamities, then all of our faith seems to go well and it carries us along, doesn't it? But when things go dramatically wrong, then sometimes our faith, our belief, and our trust does lose its power and its impact. And sometimes our faith and our belief even begins to fade and to evaporate. It's because of what's happening all around us that affects us and can knock us off a balance. Have you ever felt like that? Where something has happened in your life, totally sideswiped you and left you flat on your face. And possibly your faith, your belief, and your trust in everything that you thought begins to shake and momentarily can crumble. I'm not talking about faith in the future. We know this is going to happen. I'm talking about the faith that takes a battering because you expected certain things to happen in the present. So when we feel like that, perhaps our story here from Daniel chapter 3 may help us to clamber back onto our feet and to push on. Because for these three, and we're going to include Daniel in this thought as well, because in these three, years earlier in their life, before our story in Daniel chapter 3, they too had been totally sideswiped in a most difficult way. So let's go back. Let's go back a few years and let's just take a minute to imagine these four friends. Now I want you to just turn back to Daniel chapter 1 for a moment. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. Let's have a read here. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. A couple of things I want you to think about here. Just tuck this in the back of your mind. In the 3rd year. tuck that in the back of your mind. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came unto Jerusalem and besieged it. Two little thoughts you need to put in your margin. Underline the word Babylon, so you know what this word means, and Jerusalem, so you know what this word means. The word Babylon is from a Hebrew word which means confusion by mixing. So if you haven't got that in your margin, underline Babylon and put in your margin confusion by mixing. And underline the word Jerusalem and put in your margin vision of peace. That's what these two cities represent. So imagine how we've just read verse 1 there. Imagine how the four friends felt. Surrounding their city, surrounding their home, surrounding their family, surrounding their life, their breath, were the brutal Babylonians who had flooded down into the Middle East, into that area like a sea, and had camped, or as that word says, besieged Jerusalem. They were sitting there. They were prepared to sit there for the long haul. They were going to squeeze and suffocate all life out of that city. And four friends, and no doubt their families, consistently, day after day, prayed to their God for deliverance. I just want to focus on and turn over to Habakkuk chapter 1 and just see how scary and how brutal these Babylonians are. Just turn over to Habakkuk chapter 1 and think about these four friends surrounded and besieged in their city. In Habakkuk chapter 1, here's what the prophet Habakkuk describes these Chaldeans as like. Verse 6, Habakkuk 1. For lo, says God, I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans, a bitter and a hasty nation that are going to just tread all over your land, going to march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible, says Habakkuk. They are dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. And look at this in verse 8. Their horses are swifter than leopards. They are more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from far. They're going to fly like an eagle that hasteth to eat. They shall come all for violence. Their faces shall sup up the east wind. They're going to gather the captivity as the sand. Can you imagine the stomach of those four friends in knots, absolute knots, as outside their wall? Just imagine if we had surrounding this wall, this hall, a group of people who wanted to invade and come in and take everything, all the property that we had, and take us captivity. That's the reality of this. Can you imagine their stomach would be in absolute knots as outside the wall were these ferocious wolf-like characteristics with like eagles that hasted down to fly down and to rip off all pieces of flesh and meat and tear them away. Turn over to Jeremiah. Just turn back to Jeremiah chapter 25. Let's have another look here at another picture of the brutality of these Babylonians. Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 1. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning the people of Judah in the fourth year. What was the year we tucked in the back of our mind? Third year. We're now in the fourth year. We don't know how long that besiege took, but we're now in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, which is the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And Jeremiah goes on and he talks about in verse 3 how that for 23 years Jeremiah had been warning the people to turn away from idolatry, otherwise God's going to send the Babylonians into them. And he says in verse 4 how that he's risen early and stayed up late, but they hadn't hearkened and inclined unto the words of Jeremiah. Verse 7, ye have not hearkened unto me, says Yahweh, that ye might provoke me to anger with the works of your hands. Therefore, thus saith Yahweh, because you have not heard my words, I'm going to take all the families of the north, says Yahweh, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, is going to come down into this land with all the nations and is going to utterly destroy and make an astonishment, a hiss word, and a perpetual desolation to the city of Jerusalem. Verse 10, I'll take the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstone, and every little candle shall be put out. And the whole land, verse 11, shall be desolate and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Picture that scene, brothers and sisters, as our four friends are in that city, shuddering at the thought of the brutality that's going to eventuate. Such brutality that verse 32 says, Yahweh of hosts says, an evil shall go forth from the nation to nation. This massive storm, this massive whirlwind of the Babylonians are going to come down. And verse 33, the slain of Yahweh at that day shall be from one end of the earth to the other. That's the brutality that these four friends are facing, that's about to be unleashed upon their beloved city and people. Our God, said they, is able to deliver. And the city fell. And life for those four friends would never, ever, ever be the same again. And verse 10 is so accurate when the voice of gladness is going to be hushed and silent. No more joy, no more fraternizing, and even the little light, the little lamp is going to be snuffed out. And as those four friends were led away into captivity, their last view, as they were bound in chains, their last view, perhaps as they glanced over the shoulder, was their city, Jerusalem, on fire. Jerusalem, the vision of peace, was fading into the distance with every step they took from that moment. Picture those four young friends, brothers and sisters and young people, as we said, torn away from the city they loved, torn away from the security and safety of family and friends, torn away from their parents, perhaps they were slain, we don't know, torn away from their worship, torn away from hearing the prophet Jeremiah, torn away from their God, and they still were able to think, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. Even as they looked back over their shoulder and as they saw the last view of the city of Jerusalem on fire, they knew firsthand from that moment on the destruction of fire, the pain, the heartbreak, the fierceness, as their last view of Jerusalem saw fire within its walls. And the fire was brought upon the city of Jerusalem because the punishments of God were upon a wicked, idolatrous nation. That was why the fire was there. And the nation was sent into Babylon because of idolatry. And they go into a place, the city, that's absolutely filled, riddled with gods and idols and images. And back to our four friends, how their lives, as we said, would have been absolutely shaken, turned upside down as they were dragged from their home, parents slain, everything gone. And footstep after footstep as they walked 3,000 kilometres, they trudged through the dirt and through the dust, heading to a new foreign land. How devastated those four friends must have been. To be led away into the uncertainty of slavery. And you could forgive them if that traumatic experience had an impact upon their faith, upon their belief, and upon their trust in their God. You see, they didn't know what Jeremiah had spoken in Jeremiah chapter 24, one chapter before Jeremiah 25. Just have a look in Jeremiah 24. Yahweh showed me, behold, 2 baskets of figs were set before the temple of Yahweh. After that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away captive Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and the princes of Judah, the princes, note that, with the carpenters, smiths from Jerusalem, and had taken them to Babylon. One basket had very good figs, even like unto figs that are first ripe. The other basket had very naughty figs that could not be eaten. They were so bad. And Yahweh said to Jeremiah, what do you see, Jeremiah? And Jeremiah says, I see figs, good figs, very good. And the evil that are very evil, they can't be eaten, they're so evil. And again the word of Yahweh came unto Jeremiah, verse 5. Thus saith Yahweh, the God of Israel, like these good figs, so will I acknowledge them that are carried away captive of Judah, whom I have sent out of this place into the land of the Chaldeans, for their good. You want to underline that little statement, for their good. For I will set mine eyes upon them, says Yahweh, for good. And I will bring them back again to this land, and I will build them up, and I won't pull them down. I'll plant them and not pluck them up, says Yahweh. And I'll give them a heart to know me, that I am Yahweh, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God, for they shall return unto me with their whole heart. You see, brothers and sisters and young people, the bad situation that those four friends had experienced, the trauma, the anguish, the nightmare, the heartbreak, God allowed in the process of developing greater faith. And as we have on the screen there, Jeremiah 24, for their good. And you want to underline that little phrase and pop in your margin this quote here, a quote we know so well. Romans 8 verse 28. Underline verse 5, for their good, and put this one in margin. We know, says the Apostle Paul, that all things, the traumatic, difficult, hard things in life, all things are working together for their or our good. To those who love God, to those who are called by our God's purpose. And that's exactly what these four friends were about to experience. No doubt this prophecy would have been sent to Babylon after that first captivity. And how comforting it would have been for our four friends to have received this prophecy from Jeremiah. And they would have looked at each other with greater resolve, greater conviction, greater determination, with a greater purpose and persistence, that they would never and ever submit to the Babylonian influence, knowing that their God has done this for their good. At times, we don't always realise that God does allow those good figs to endure difficulties and uncertainty to develop faith. To develop a faith that brings one to the absolute belief that there is nothing they can do but to completely rely on what their God can do. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. And for these four friends, it was now just the beginning of what was to be a resolution and a resolve that, come what may, in the confusion of Babylon, they all together, with a purpose in heart, were to stick together and support each other, whatever the situation they were to face. Difficult times were ahead of them for sure, in a foreign land, both physically and mentally, as the Babylonian king would try to break their spirit to submit and to assimilate into the Babylonian ways. So just have a look at these four friends, and let's see how that these four friends, the hand of God is stamped all over their life. Just have a look at this for a moment. Four friends as they made their way to the land of Babylon. Josephus tells us, we've got this little quote that we saw, or we read in a minute in Daniel. Josephus tells us that they were of the king's seed and of the princes. So let's just come back to Daniel chapter 1 and just have a look at that in Daniel chapter 1, verse 3. Right at the end of verse 3, it says there that there were certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and princes that were taken into captive, into Babylon. A couple of quotes you want to put next to verse 3. Write these ones down. Ezekiel 17, verse 12, which says, "Behold, the king of Babylon is come to Jerusalem, and he's taken the king and the princes, and he's led them into Babylon." So that's Ezekiel 17, verse 12. And also the reading 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 17 and 18. So pop that next to verse 3, 2 Kings 20, verse 17 to 18, which says, and these were words, of course, to Hezekiah, "Behold, the days come that all that is in thy house and that which thy fathers have laid up in store unto this day is going to be carried into Babylon, says Yahweh. And of thy sons that issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they're going to be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Quite possibly, our four friends were exactly, as Daniel says here, of the king's seed. Quite possibly, they may well have been princes, descendants of Hezekiah himself. Let's have a look at our four friends and just see how the hand of God seems to be stamped over their lives. Look at Daniel's name. God is my judge. So what you want to do, on the bottom of Daniel chapter 1, we're going to put these four names and these four friends and their meanings. Daniel's name, God is my God, or my judge. And he's mentioned 70 times in the scriptures. 70 times. 5 times out of the book of Daniel, but 70 times in the book of Daniel. 70 times. 3 times by Ezekiel, 2 times by the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, this is interesting. You know, when John the Baptist was born and they came to him and said, what are you going to name him? Aren't you going to name him after someone in your family? And they said, no, his name is to be John. They were surprised. Is it possible that Daniel, this man Daniel, was named, only supposition here, nothing to prove it at all, but was he named after King David's son to Abigail? The first son she had, she called Daniel. Was Daniel, our friend in Daniel's prophecy, was he named after this boy of Abigail's? A woman that we know was of good understanding, exactly what's described as the characteristic of our friend Daniel, and of a beautiful countenance. We don't know. May have been, may not have been. Interesting that it's from the king's seed, and he could well have been named after this young son of Abigail. Hananiah means God has been gracious, mentioned graciously 5 times. There was a man in captivity, Zerubbabel, in 1 Chronicles 3 verse 19, who may have, supposition, may have named his son after Hananiah, who also had 2 sons whilst in captivity, Jesaiah, which means save thou Yahweh, and Pelatiah, which means Yahweh's way of escape. May have been, may not have been. Interesting with the same name. Shadrach, of course, which the Babylonian name given to him means the inspiration of the sun. Mishael, the third of our friend, is named, or his name means who is like ale. 5 times again he's mentioned in Daniel's prophecy. And here's an interesting one. Was Mishael named after Aaron's cousin, who carried out the burnt body of Nadab and Abihu when they were struck down by fire in Leviticus chapter 10? May have been, may not have been. Interesting that that name is connected with the burning of the body of Aaron's 2 boys who offered strange fire. His Babylonian name was Meshach, and it says that means he who belongs to Shishak, which of course the Babylonian stuff doesn't really mean too much for us. But the last one, Azariah, helped of Yahweh, mentioned 5 times. There's quite a few Azariahs in the scripture, so a lot of supposition here. There's Zadok, the priest had one. Nathan, the prophet to David, had a son called that. The prophet Azariah himself stood up, and there was another priest who stopped Uzziah. A lot of supposition, may not have been the case. But his Babylonian name was Abednego, which means the servant of the shining light or fire. So these 4 friends were smart, hand-selected, hand-picked men that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to train and manipulate into his way of life. And he put them, as we know, in Daniel chapter 1, on a 3-year educational course. Special treatment was involved, as we know. And look what it says in verse 6 of Daniel chapter 1. And now, among those of the children of Judah were our 4 friends, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. 4 friends, 4 Jewish captives. But there must have been a lot of other Jewish captives that are not singled out in Daniel's prophecy. They're not named. They didn't stand apart, possibly. They didn't separate like our 4 friends did. Just think about that for a moment. There possibly were hundreds of other young men But their faith needed further development. Whilst these 4 friends were absolutely prepared and committed. And sometimes we may feel the pressure and struggle in our everyday life to make a stand. And we may see others who have characteristics like these 4 friends who tower above us in their faith. Faith that we feel can probably move mountains. Faith that we feel we can never seem to attain unto that. And like these others in Daniel chapter 1, we may feel that our faith may fail, and we may feel that, like the others that are unnamed here, we just eat the king's meat. Or perhaps in our story in Daniel chapter 3, when we get to it, we may feel that we would have just bowed down to that image. And you may feel that you're struggling even now in that situation or something similar, where you see others stand up, but you yourself feel worthless and useless, and your faith has failed. Never give up. We may not all have a faith like these 4 friends, but it does not mean that the others were wiped out of God's purpose. Not at all. They were still in the process of developing a faith that's going to be like the faith of these 4 friends indeed. Philippians chapter 1 verse 6 says, we have to be confident of this, that God, who has begun a good work within you, will continue his work until it's finally finished on the day of Christ when he appears. Don't give up. You see, there was another man who stood around a fire. And he, on that moment, on that night, he cursed and he swore and he said he never knew that man, the Lord Jesus Christ. And he was around a fire, and his faith failed. But the Lord had some comforting words for him in Luke chapter 22 when he said this. He said, and he looked at Peter in the eye, and he says, Peter, I've prayed for you, that your faith fail not. And when you're converted, he says, strengthen your brethren. Never give up, brothers and sisters and young people. Never give up. Even though you might feel that you've failed, like possibly Peter did, always take comfort that God is working in your life, and he will work in to bring all things together that will be of good for us. So we have in our story in Daniel chapter 1, while others may have eaten, for 3 years, it says in verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not eat or defile himself of the king's meat, nor of the wine which he drank. And there was a pact which these 4 friends, earlier on, they stood apart. They stood early, because the longer they left it, the harder it would have been. And they purposed in their heart. And we know, brothers and sisters and young people, that all 4 friends were involved. And sometimes when you've got others standing alongside of you, it can be helpful to strengthen your commitment and your resolve. And we know that all 4 friends were on the same page, because just look how they talked to their to say to Nebuchadnezzar, prove thy servants. They're all in this together. Give us our conscience, thy servants. He consented them, there. All through this little section, it shows that as a group, these 4 friends were working together. And it was a friendship that was forged with love, the love of God. And it was a friendship that allowed them right at the start of this incident here to stand. A little word that's going to see echoed into our chapter, into Daniel chapter 3. So let's come over to Daniel chapter 3, and it's not surprising, brothers and sisters, it's not surprising at all that our story begins with this commanding opening line in verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king. The chapter starts with this authority and with this respect. It starts, brothers and sisters, with the full, regal, impressive, powerful title, Nebuchadnezzar the king. And turn the page and just see how it closes. Turn the page in verse 30, and it closes with a humble, simple little phrase, then the king. What a journey this king is going to be on in this chapter. What a journey, what a discovery, what a lesson he's about to learn. You see, chapter 3 of Daniel chapter 3, it commences with the king. He's just returned and he's flushed with the victory of finishing his Jewish and Syrian wars. And he's got all the spoils and all the booty and so forth. Nebuchadnezzar the king is emphasized in the very opening statement. And constantly through this chapter, we're going to see it's emphasized that he thinks he is in absolute control. He's the king of the world. He's the conqueror of all people, nations, and languages. And this proud phrase, Nebuchadnezzar the king, is unique in this chapter. Because prior to this chapter, this phrase, Nebuchadnezzar the king, is not used at all in chapters 1 and 2. But it's here in our story where the chapter is absolutely flooded with this title, Nebuchadnezzar the king. Just have a look at this little statement here. Nebuchadnezzar the king. All through this little section here, this royal, regal, emphasizing the authority of Nebuchadnezzar, the power that this man had. Before this, only 3 times is he referred to in the same verse as Nebuchadnezzar and king. Back in chapter 1, verse 1, as we've already read, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. It's not Nebuchadnezzar the king. It's just Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And again in chapter 2, verse 28, it's just the phrase Nebuchadnezzar the king Nebuchadnezzar. And again in verse 46, not the regal phrase that we've got here. Not the arrogant, pompous declaration. But he does change. The chapter opens, as we said, with Nebuchadnezzar the king, but he does change when we get to the last section here in our story where it's Nebuchadnezzar, then Nebuchadnezzar, and finally then the king. Humility is the lesson that this king is constantly forced to face and control. And it seems strange, doesn't it, that we have such a change in the opening verse of chapter 3 from the concluding verses of chapter 2. And we know Daniel chapter 2 is all about the dream which Nebuchadnezzar had and how it was explained and how at the closing of Daniel chapter 2, just have a look how Daniel chapter 2 closes. Verse 46, the king Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face. Wow. That's unheard of. Can you picture that? The king Nebuchadnezzar, he stands up off his throne and he falls to the ground prostrate in front of these 4 Jewish friends. Something that he's forgotten in Daniel chapter 3. And look what he says. As he says in verse 47, he says, the king answered Daniel, of a truth, your God is a God of gods and a Lord of lords, a revealer of secrets. Something that he seems to have forgotten in Daniel chapter 3. Look at the end of verse 15 where he says, who is that God that shall deliver you? Why has Nebuchadnezzar's outlook changed from the end of chapter 2, where he's proclaiming the greatness of the God of Daniel, and it seems totally forgotten just 3 verses later in Daniel chapter 3, where we've got Nebuchadnezzar the king? Because we certainly can see flowing through Daniel chapter 2 and through into chapter 3, consistency of the faith of the 3 friends. We see that. That goes straight through from chapter 2 and it's consistent through into chapter 3. Loud and clear is the faith, but not of the king. Why is that? Because here's a powerful lesson which I want you to think about, and it's summed up in the word consistency. You see, in the Septuagint, we're going to see this consistency of the faith of these 3 friends. You see, the Septuagint commences Daniel chapter 3 with this phrase here. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar the king. Daniel chapter 2 was in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar, and we've got a gap of 17 years, a substantial gap between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. Sure, there's significant links, as we're going to see with chapter 2, with images and gold that flows into our story. But possibly that's why the king's memory isn't as sharp, isn't as focused, isn't as switched on as it was in the lesson he learnt 17 years earlier. And here's a lesson for us. The three friends had not changed. They had not compromised their stand, even though 17 years had dragged by. And the question we ask ourselves individually is our faith as strong, as stable, as sound as it was 17 years ago? Can we stand up without a pause, without a hesitation, and commit ourselves to those things that we absolutely were committed to 17 years ago? You see, these three friends, their faith had not tarnished in any way during the last 17 years. Isn't that astounding that their golden faith had not tarnished a bit? And when their faith was to be put to the fire, as Peter records, their faith remained strong. You know, it would have been really easy for those three friends over 17 years to have gradually blended in to Babylonian life. It would have been very easy for them to have integrated into the society, to be sucked into the lifestyle of Babylonian living, the amazing architecture, and seeing what was developed in Babylon every single day of the past 17 years. They could have easily been sucked into the accomplishments that this brilliant man Nebuchadnezzar was building right before their eyes in the past 17 years. Do you ever look at the world around us, at some of the modern buildings, and just stand in absolute awe of what man has achieved? We see these three friends, they stood firm, stood apart, even though they were living in the most developed city in the world. A city which this man Nebuchadnezzar, in a chapter on, is about to proclaim, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might and by the power and by the majesty of me. Isn't this great Babylon? And these three friends could have easily assimilated into the thinking of Babylon is great, just as we can assimilate into the thinking of modern technology and modern life in the cities in which we live is great. Imagine this city, Babylon, the famous Ishtar Gate that these three friends would have seen being developed right before their eyes. Imagine some of these facts that I'm going to put to you now about Babylon. Just think about this. And here, Babylon was a great city. Even the scriptures itself define the city of Babylon as the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' excellency. It's termed the golden city, the lady of kingdoms, the destroying mountain. It's termed the praise of the whole earth. This is where these four friends were growing up, in the midst of this city. A tree in the midst of the earth. It's a head of gold. It's a lion with a man's heart. I want to just show a little bit about the greatness of this city, Babylon. Babylon is a word which means the gate of God, and as I said right at the start, or confusion by mixing, because it comes from this root word confusion. Some other names in scripture are Shishak and Merathaim. So that's what Babylon means and what it was. Built back, of course, right back in the Genesis chapter 10. Babylon is located, one of the most famous cities of Mesopotamia. It's the land between the two rivers, the Fertile Crescent. It's around about 94 kilometres southwest of Baghdad. It's built between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates in an area that the soil is so rich, so deep and so fertile. Very lush is that area in which these four boys were now subjected to. Herodotus, who is the father of history, says that Babylon surpasses in splendour any city in the known world. That's where these four boys, these four friends had to grow up. And for 17 years, they were influenced by what we're about to see here now at the city of Babylon. As I said there, the famous Ishtar Gate. And on the Ishtar Gate is this amazing tiling. I don't know if any of you have even actually seen a replica of this, but it's an amazing gate, a massive gate, which King Nebuchadnezzar was right in the process of building as these boys would have come back. There's this big procession way, which when there was any victorious in battles and so forth, the king would be triumphant as he goes around about 100 metres through these massive procession way alongside of these massive buildings right through into the city of Babylon itself. You can see here, you can imagine the pageantry that Daniel and his three friends were subjected to day after day. Here's some facts about Babylon. It was the largest city of its time. 3 million people were in this city of Babylon. Here's a few facts. It was in the form of a square, 22.5 kilometres on each side. The circumference of the wall was 90 kilometres. Just try and get your head around some of this is according to Herodotus, the size of this city Babylon. The wall was 300 feet high. And it extended 35 feet below the ground. 25 feet thick was this massive wall. 25 feet thick. That was wide enough for 4 horses to go flashing by each other around the wall. The walls, and I've got a note here, I'm not going to turn it up now, we're a bit late, but Jeremiah talks about how these walls are going to be absolutely crashing down in the destruction that Babylon's going to face. 250 towers, 450 feet high, these 250 towers that went right around the walls of the city of Babylon. 100 bronze gates. We know that it was one of those bronze gates that were left open that allowed the Persians to enter into the city. And there was a deep, wide moat that encircled the city. Here's some of the facts about this huge city that for the last 17 years, those 4 friends were growing up in. The Euphrates flowed through the middle. Its streets were paved with stone slabs. There's great towers built there. There was a golden image of Baal, a golden table, both, Herodotus says, over 50,000 pounds of solid gold, 2 lions, a solid gold human figure. Nebuchadnezzar's palace was considered the most magnificent building ever erected on earth to that time. And of course, there was one of the 7 wonders, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, that were there. And it goes on, Babylon, this is Babylon that I have built, said Nebuchadnezzar. You would never, ever, ever think that city would crumble. So completely was it destroyed that for years men didn't even know where it was. The biggest city in the then known world was completely destroyed, and it was only in 1811 where they started to discover some of the ruins of this city Babylon. You know, brothers and sisters and young people, there are over 250 verses in the scripture that talk about the destruction of this city. If we could sort of imagine like a city of 3 million. I know Melbourne and Sydney is probably more than that, but you imagine somebody saying that place is going to be totally desolate. There will be nobody living there. It will not be inhabited. That's what it was like to say that Babylon was going to be destroyed. And within 70 years, these prophecies came absolutely true. So Nebuchadnezzar, he was the real genius in the building of Babylon. For 70 years, it existed. Only 70 years, this massive city. 43 of which Nebuchadnezzar was in total control and was on these this great building feat that he did in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned more than any other Gentile king in the scriptures. In 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. He's all through the prophecies. He's a brilliant man, according to Sir George Rawlington. He says, and I'll just quote this little phrase here, that all through Babylon, his name had, on the bricks, his name was stamped on all the bricks through Babylon. 9/10 of all the bricks that they've uncovered in Babylon has the name Nebuchadnezzar stamped on those bricks. So we're going to come now, brothers and sisters, to that little phrase, Nebuchadnezzar the king. We're going to see now there's a link that this chapter, Daniel chapter 3, has, of course, with Daniel chapter 2. And it's in this phrase, image. And this little phrase, which we're going to see recurs time and time and time again through our chapter, has a definite link back to Daniel chapter 2. But unfortunately, brothers and sisters and young people, our time has now expired, and that link will have to wait until our next class, when not only the link of image we're going to see, but we're also going to see another little phrase, the word set up, is also a link that we're going to discover in Daniel 2 that flows into our chapter in Daniel chapter 3.